A slightly late start, and so my introduction will be mercifully brief. Interesting, isn't it, as we've seen over the weekend, how something can suddenly trigger a huge interest in a subject that seems to have been floating around for maybe decades. And last year, of course, it was ChatGPT, but the panellists today have been thinking about AI and what it can do, and especially artificial intelligence in defence and security for a very long time. But the salience and the emergence of technologies, artificial intelligence, but also quantum computing, the connectivity which is starting to reorientate everything to do with our socio-economy, our industry, our personal lives, and perhaps especially salient as well, autonomous systems with drones grabbing the headlines everywhere from the Red Sea through to Ukraine. And suddenly there's a convergence of interest. This is a very timely session this morning. We have with us Lord David Willits. For 23 years, the MP for Havant, but more importantly for our purposes today, he was the Ministry of State for Universities and Science. He is chair of the UK Space Agency Board before moving on to be the president of the Resolution Foundation, and for Policy Exchange wrote the report on the 8 great technologies and has been thinking about all of this sort of thing for a very long time. And we also have with us Anthony Finkelstein, currently the president of City University, where he's been since 2021. But he moved there from being the chief scientific advisor for national security, a post he held for 6 years from 2015. A software systems engineer by background, but also a founder trustee of the Alan Turing Institute, which has been leading the way in the thinking about artificial intelligence in this country. I can't think of 2 better people to steer our conversation this morning. The way we're going to run it is I'm going to invite Anthony to give us some few remarks, probably steered towards the technologies of artificial in defence, what it can and can't do, and then I'll come to Lord David to broaden that out perhaps into artificial intelligence, how government interacts with it, and especially how the MOD interacts with it, and how the MOD interacts with other government departments. And so we'll then tee up a conversation. If there are some immediate points, I'll steer them, but if I see hands going up from all over the audience, which I hope is true, and we have people online, then I will quickly as possible go to the floor so you can grill these 2 experts and steer the conversation that way, which will be much better than listening to me. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Anthony.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful to everybody who's here today. Fortunately, the tubes are working, and I'm very annoyed that I spent most of my Sunday unsuccessfully trying to fix the brakes on my bike to ensure that I was here promptly. This is a public opportunity to continue a discussion that David and I have had on numerous occasions and arising out of our shared service on the board of UKRI, the UK's science funder, where we've been both share an interest in the role that security and defence play in shaping the UK science and technology agenda, and vice versa, the role that science and technology might play in shaping our future defence and security agenda. In any talk about which starts with the with AI on the slides, and I seem as a software engineer to have the misfortune to find that most often, it's worthwhile just holding something in mind. I don't know, as a technologist, I've had various points in my career where I've experienced shocks, moments of profound surprise, when I have looked at a technology and suddenly had that moment of understanding, of it dawning on me what its consequences might be. They don't happen often in a group. Now, I've been playing around with neural nets and so on since the early 1980s, along with other computer sciences. I left it behind and showed actually more interest in rule-based artificial intelligence, but followed the technology, followed recent advances in machine learning, indeed followed the work that was being done to scale up language models. And never during that period did I imagine in any way what the actual consequences of that work might be its own. And it's only when being confronted with it. And similarly, I'd been interested in search engines. I used many of the early search engines. That was at MIT. Somebody showed me Google for the first time, and struck me forcibly. My God, this really changes everything. And all of us, I think, have looked at or I suspect most of us will have looked at these technologies and had that moment of technical shock of going, my goodness me, this really changes things. We need to hold on to that in any consideration about how the implications of this technology. And those of us strongly interested in defense and security above all. And I have to tell you, colleagues, that it is not simply that. It is also the fact of a whole series of rapid technical convergences that relate to a whole range of technologies from those involving the biology and the life sciences, of which David has shown particular interest, and all the way across to new mathematical techniques that might underpin new models of privacy and security. So across the whole swathe of things, and indeed quantum, across the whole swathe of things, technical change at a rate and a pace which even those inured to it somewhat need to actually internalize. The next thing to say is that science and technology is now very clearly a domain of geopolitical contest. It is a domain of geopolitical contest. Indeed, it might be one of the primary domains of geopolitical contest. And that contest is in terms of societal resilience, it's in terms of prosperity, and it is in terms of defense and national security. And in that context, the interpenetration of defense and security and the way in which we approach technologies is of primary importance. I believe that and I suspect many members of the audience come from the defense and security community, that what we have to contribute to the discussion about these technologies is fundamentally a competitive mindset. That we situate an understanding of technologies in the context of strategic competition. We understand what that means, and to some extent, though not wholly and not satisfactorily, we understand how to analyze those situations. And now we need to bring that to bear. We need the mindset and understanding of from defense and security brought to the problems of how we might strategize in the context of science and technology. So that's my core pitch. In our introductory questions. Ed used to ask me something about the implications for some of these technologies for defence and security more generally. I would say this, that the new set of technologies, artificial intelligence running through them as a strand, or autonomy, sensing, large-scale data processing, advances in actuation, a whole range of those technologies are fundamentally different in engineering class from what we have dealt with before, because the systems we need to build will no longer be monolithic, but will be compositional, requiring a new set of operating models, development models, a new set of procurement methods, and strategies. So the disruption is not simply at the technological level, where Ukraine bears witness, but so much more. I'll leave it there.
Anthony, thank you very much. So this is not something that we blister onto the side of the nice, convenient, comfortable ways that we've been doing business for a long time, and that it is a fundamental part of the geopolitical contest, and therefore we are hopeful that we will see in the defence and security arena in the UK that competitive mindset to push the cutting edge development of these vital capacities. So turning to Lord Willits, does the MOD and government see it that way? Is it ready to compete in a world of what used to be known as operational requirements?
I think the MOD and the security people, and this is not my world, I've always been on the civil and commercial side, but I think the people in the defence and security scene do see it that way. And just to set the scene in the way Anthony has, for me, the biggest single change in R&D policy in Britain in the last 5 or so years has been the arrival of the security angle on every science and technology decision. And my view is that that is net a good thing. I think it does have some tricky issues which I want to identify, but it's net a good thing. And one of the reasons why I've so enjoyed my discussions over the years with Anthony is that Anthony, coming more from a security perspective, and I have had lots of discussions of precisely this issue. And I'm here because I think one of the strengths of policy exchange is the way you link, not least through your role, Ed, the security and defence angle with wider issues, and also because 10 years ago I analysed the 8 great technologies for policy exchange, and recently I've done a 10-year update of my 8 great technologies exercise. I did try, as the science minister, by the way, to engage defence and security on some of these technologies, and there is a standard brief written for the MOD ministers and senior officials entitled "What to Say When a Civil Minister Who's Trying to Get Some of Your Budget Comes Calling." And the answer is, it's nothing to do with us. You go ahead and spend your money the way you want. Your attempt to try to link up with us and spend some of our money as well, we understand it, but no deal. So my naive attempts at working with MOD when I was a minister always failed, and I don't blame them for it. I understand the hardened departmental interest that led to that approach. But it is now changing. There is much greater integration than ever before, and I always think that the reason why this is overall a good thing was a Cambridge tech entrepreneur saying to me, why is it that the security agencies are so concerned about the significance of my technology that they won't allow me to have any dealings with the Chinese, but the Treasury and the Business Department are so sure they can't possibly assess the value of any new technology that they won't fund it themselves. And the confidence of the security and defence people in thinking about technology is massively refreshing compared with an ageing doctrine which is disappearing, but the classic Treasury view, which is all changes in technology are unpredictable, exogenous, cannot be steered, and nobody has any capacity to decide what there may be value in, and we should therefore preferably not fund any of it, which was the old doctrine, and you came across it within the Treasury. That has collapsed under the face of the security perspective, and the integrated review and the prominent role it gives to science and technology is evidence of that. So that's basically the good news. There are, however, tricky issues which I don't think we've yet fully resolved. First, it is all the experts on the defence and security side getting together in meetings only available for people with relatively high security classifications, come out for those meetings and say to civil people who don't have the security classifications to participate in them, this is a dual use technology. They're so smart they can think of a dual use for almost anything. You're not allowed to find out exactly what this dual use is, but they say this is a dual use technology and therefore you've got to do X, Y, and Z and not do A, B, and C. And one of the urgent programs underway at the moment is you need to get greater security clearance and more of the civil experts, so at least they can participate in these discussions and not just be presented with arguments which basically say, if you knew what we knew, you would understand why this is a problem, which is so frustrating and is a way of stopping rational discussion linking defence and civil people. That's the first problem. The second problem is that people on the defence and security side do requirement thinking. And their thinking is, so what is the national need for this? And requirement thinking is different from economic opportunity thinking. And often the government objectives for spending money on domestic programs and domestic technologies is to do things like secure economic growth or attract overseas investment. And you can have some American company that turns up, or it needn't be American, but let's say an American company turns up, which wants to do a £200 million investment. And he's basically saying to you, if the government puts in 20 million, or if you put in 50 million, we'll spend 150 million in the UK. In the old days, that was a simple economic assessment. If we put in 50 million, will they really put in 150? And where will they put the money? And that's a good thing. Now, because everything is suffused with a security perspective, the question is there a national requirement for this? If there isn't, if there's a national requirement, maybe we should spend 50 million. But if there's not a national requirement, why are we spending 50 million of a limited budget? Because the budget should all go on requirements. So what can happen is the deal-doing instinct just to get economic activity in the UK gets obstructed or slowed up by a very different way of seeing the world, namely, is there a national requirement, and if not, there's no possible use of the money. And of course, in turn, requirement thinking is captured in the own collaborate access model, and you'll be surprised at the number of what were previously simple commercial public R&D spend decisions now get caught up in an extra 6 months of analysis. Do we need to own this or collaborate on it or have access to it? Which is not always relevant if you're just trying to do a deal so the investment comes to Britain instead of going to France or to Israel. So the requirement thinking can slow things up and can also sometimes be irrelevant for a decision that you're trying to make. That's the second problem. And the third problem is the special relationship. And the special relationship is this peculiar, subtle, ever-changing thing with large numbers of often barely stated quid pro quos and lots of judgments all the time. How much do we need to do for the Americans in order for the Americans to carry on providing the security umbrella for us? Are we doing enough? Are we doing sufficient? Should we do a bit more so as that the Americans remain happy? Is this a priority for the special relationship? And that perspective is completely different from a civil perspective, where often the sheer power of US economic and political interest is such that you're trying to invest and maintain some capacity to avoid something being completely stripped out and moved to the US. One of my aims with the science budget was at least to spend enough on a technology for long enough that when the Americans come calling and quite possibly buy it, the R&D roots are sufficiently deep that they can't just move it lock, stock and barrel to the West Coast. And the commercial perspective on the US is different than the management of the special relationship, which is done by highly skilled people, but in a way that is sometimes hard for people coming from a more civil perspective properly to understand. And again, in the world of space, that's been a big shift. There used to be a view, and I was very aware of it, that space services are basically provided for us by the US. There's been a very significant shift in MOD thinking in the last few years to a view that actually it's worth our having some kind of requirement. Now, when we move on specifically to AI, the only comment I had, and here I should declare an interest. I'm on the board of Darktrace, which is a cybersecurity company, and in many ways it applies machine learning to the cybersecurity offer we make. I think the key issue, the key advice for people is don't let outside organizations, including the big new AI companies, scrape all your data. First of all, there's a clear sense it doesn't belong to them, and I think the legal cases, and we've seen the New York Times in the last few days, Getty Images a while back, I think they have clearly accessed large amounts of data where it was not totally clear they had the legal rights to use it the way they did, and I think there's a set of tricky legal issues which are going to have to be resolved. And meanwhile, you lose control over your data. So the most important single advice for any UK operator, both for commercial reasons and for security reasons, is don't let other people scrape your data. Protect it and keep it behind a wall. And when people come calling and seem to wish to scrape your data, don't let them do it. Then, of course, the challenge for us is to do something with the data ourselves, and the endless frustration above all here is NHS data. Life sciences data is unrivaled in theory. I can still remember going to New York with Boris when he was mayor, he was taking a group of UK life sciences experts to see New York, and it became obvious that how we wanted to use genetic sequencing, linking it to medical records, to link genetic data and other data to understand people's health conditions was just impossible in the US because they had not got all these different medical records linked up. There is an opportunity there for us. We've never been able to properly seize it, but I think these new technologies in AI give us an even greater opportunity than we've had before to seize that opportunity.
I've got a few immediate responses, if I may. The first, we're on common ground about security classification and clearances. We've got a broken clearances system, and we institutionally overclassify, and things need to be, and this needs attention from the defence and security community. I am no longer convinced that the very notion of dual use actually is the right analytic frame. An example from my own institution. Actually, a student rocks up, applies for overseas student applies for permission to work on green trains. And ATAS, approved. This research is okay. 3 years later, same work, has to apply for a fresh clearance. Writes down using AI to understand battery state. Clearance denied. It's the same work. It's absolutely the same work. So we just need to think about how we're actually starting to analyse these issues. On requirements thinking, I am 100% aligned with David. And here I think is a very interesting point about the technologies, which is the nature of the technologies means that this classical form of thinking no longer things like that, because actually what you're doing is integrating components iteratively across an architecture which itself is dynamic. So we need a new form of systems thinking to correspond to this. We have, I think the defence and security and the science and technology community have made massive progress in terms of the strategic tools they have in place. but they're still not properly joined up. So yes, we have DCIT. Yes, we have national. We have a national S&T Council. Yes, we have a series of security mechanisms embedded in departments, but the join up still needs to be effected. There is one other critical thing that is missing at the moment in the UK scene, which is high quality scientific intelligence. And I don't use that word in terms of just saying, by which I do not mean covert intelligence. I actually mean that our understanding of our competitors and adversaries' science and technology base is inadequate. Our existing mechanisms, are not fit for purpose, and we nor scaled to meet this new context, and we need to address it. So those are some immediate reactions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I know you've pushed the buttons of some of the people in the audience here, and I know there's at least one running an AI business who works with one of our major universities who found it very difficult to find a student that wasn't Chinese working on national security work. And I just wondered, and I could come straight back, I've got 2 points here. The first would be, you've raised data, you've raised cross-government working, you've raised intellectual property, a lot of which resides in the university. What are the policy shifts you think we would have to make to get us to realise that the new world is going to rely on the sort of things you've put forward, and why are there hurdles at the moment to better use of data, for the way we work with universities, etc., etc.?
I mean, firstly, just to say universities are on a security journey. They have made very rapid progress. There is good guidance. There is now, good working with RCAT. The research professionals are much better informed. But this is quite a large transition. I think mechanically there's good things, but maybe there is there's a issue, I think, a little bit with hearts and minds as well. As an aside, universities will continue to find things difficult whilst there isn't a clearly articulated China policy for the UK, and the more progress we can make on that, the better. And, it's a big topic, and it was a few excursions.
I think David. And there are now sort of assured research arrangements, but it ties in with what Anthony was saying a moment ago about intelligence, about what's happening. Sometimes, again, even in my limited experience, different security agencies have different perspectives. There's a very fine judgment sometimes between if you wish to collaborate or do some shared research, it does enable you to understand better what's going on in another country. And you'll get different views as to whether you are a net gainer or a net loser. If you don't have research participation partnerships with China, you'll over time have a diminishing understanding of what's going on in China. That itself is a cost. And I think my external observer's impression is sometimes I don't think even the security agencies have quite worked out what the right balance is to strike there.
I mean, just to say that, for example, there are two particular universities where research programs have had bright lights shining. Well, let's talk about it. So Cambridge's work in comms was an example of somewhere where they had a bright light shone on them, and it is far from clear to me, having looked at that work in significant detail, it's far from clear to me where the line of benefit.
And look, I mean, straying into an old controversy, but who are we? I mean, my view was the original model with Huawei, where all their tech that came to the UK was tested at Banbury and appraised before it entered the UK system, was one that was in the interests of Huawei because it gave them a clean bill of health to sell into the UK and as a result several other markets, but was also the UK's interest. It meant we're moving fast in 5G in a mutually understood way. It was American pressure that led to the end of that arrangement. And I'm still not convinced, and now Huawei, which will remain a very successful global business, will be introducing its telecom systems in many key markets around the world, and our understanding of it will be diminished.
So I have to, just for the record,
I know we disagree on that.
I profoundly disagree with this position. So it is undoubtedly true there was American pressure, but fundamentally 5G is architected differently, and the security guarantees that could be provided by the approach ante, which was essentially to keep Huawei out of the core and manage the software development process, was no longer viable.
So I think we'll bank that there's a disagreement here, which I'm going to cut across. Can I just say before I move on, please do, I'll be scanning the audience, please catch my eye, raise your hand, and I will log you for questions, which come to very soon. But the other point, I suppose, of my question was, why are there so many overseas students that are so advanced in this, and why are there so few Brits? And it brings to the point you both touched on, is has the government been making the macro case? And if I could move from universities and education into data, I carry the scars from 2018 of introducing information advantage into the MOD and trying to explain that data is the new oil, and yet progress in storing data and thinking about data as an asset has been glacial. You mentioned, David, the NHS. Yeah. Have we made the case to people that why data can be an asset and why it will be in their interests to offer it up and not necessarily play to their fears that someone's going to get hold of their data?
We're very bad at maintaining rigorously data of any quality. I mean, the experts, and I'm not an expert on AI, are often quite good at using dirty and poor quality data, but often government departments, I'm thinking for example of Department of Work and Pensions, are crippled by an anxiety that their data isn't good enough to share with researchers, who will then reveal what sloppy stuff it is, so they tend to say no unnecessarily. I think that's a problem. Going back to the China issue, sorry, just one other observation, which is, remember, we now don't pay, the level of fees for universities is not now enough to cover the costs of teaching, especially with the extra obligations governments had, like the Access Programme. So universities are seeking overseas students for the purpose of cross-subsidising domestic teaching. They used to recruit a lot of Chinese students. They were then told, you're too dependent on China, branch out. They branched out to a set of countries with big opportunities like India, Nigeria. It so happens that by and large Chinese students come on their own. Students from India and Nigeria tend to bring, partly because of younger family formation, tend to bring family members with them. Now the government is saying don't bring family members, which will lead to, I predict, an increase in the proportion of our students that come from China. So the policy trade-offs seem to shift frequently.
But does introduce that idea, I'm sure the audience will pick up on, of what is an industrial strategy, and does it cross other departments, and should it be pushing earlier people into these subjects, such as we had a whole load of homegrown talent going through. But I have seen the odd hand go up, so I'm going to come to the gentleman at the back there, and then I'll come down to this gentleman at the front. Could I just ask you to state your name and your organisation? Yes, Keith.
Thank you. Great to be amongst friends, and an excellent panel, made all the better for the airing of the genuine trade-offs that come from the disagreements. I'm going to commit that most heinous of sins, a comment and a question, if you'll forgive me.
Could you say who you are? And
Keith Deere, from Fujitsu, former advisor number 10 on science tech and the integrated review. The brief comment was, Anthony, you mentioned the importance of science intelligence, and I think another glaring gap is the absence of economic intelligence since we killed the Economic Intelligence Unit in the MOD on the basis it'd be replaced in the Cabinet Office, and then of course it never was, which is a huge gap in an era of geo-economic competition. My question is to introduce a new topic which I hope will be fruitful on artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence. It's my contention that in 2011, Mark Andreessen said software was eating the world. It took nearly a decade for the MOD to listen to many people internally that were saying this was happening and they needed to pay attention. It was around 2015, 2016 when the speed of advance in AI became apparent. You could still be laughed at in the MOD as recently as 2019 for saying that AI was going to be crucial for future warfare. Today, the Metaculus forecast, the aggregated forecasting estimates for ASI are between 3 years and 7 years. Do you think that we need to take that seriously, and what might be the consequences of not doing so?
Thank you. Who wants to say that one first?
I mean, firstly, the point about economic intelligence is fascinating because, of course, there's scientific and technical intelligence embedded in this, in a common matrix with some of that. So I think that's a very interesting observation. I mean, forecasting in some of these areas is a bit of a mug's game, in particular, I'm always slightly in trepidation of extrapolating, of extrapolation in some of these contexts. So it is unclear to me with some of the artificial intelligence technologies where we might hit quite the buffers and what those buffers might actually be. So I am, and some of this may well have to do with questions about data and data access and scale and some of the constraints of stability of these models that arise from that. What I would say is clear is there are further immediate prospects of significant improvements in functionality, that already it is the case that these systems perform adequately on rich and context-embedded human tasks, and we have a great deal to be getting on with as it stands.
Thank you, Anthony. David?
Yeah, I'm a bit doubtful. I do think the sort of hallucinate problem is quite a serious problem, and the more that it is embedded in the system and generates results, you can have further results down, and you gradually get untethered from what in some very crude sense you may think of as reality, and this very skilled symbolic analysis is to some extent parasitic on a set of data developed in an earlier world when you were trying to do things that connected to empirical reality. So I am still a bit of a long-term skeptic about AI, and I think the risks of it coming up with hallucinatory results which are unconnected to reality, if anything, will grow.
If I may, very briefly. The first is, I'm not absolutely convinced. Hallucination is not a problem, it's a feature. It is in some senses of the essence of the technology. The critical thing, and I think it's something we really all need to keep in mind, is the rest of computer science has not gone away.
Yeah.
You can still do a database lookup. It's not like you can still do a mechanistic physics-based model. You don't need to purely rely upon artificial intelligence. It's the potential hybridity which gives the additional power, rather than just adding, extra data and chips to your model.
So hallucination is a feature, not a bug. It's like the 1960s all over again. Hugo.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Hugo Rosemont. I work at the defence company KBR, which includes Fraser National, which is engaged in AI assurance. I'm fascinated by this insert on the industrial strategy for the UK, and my question is around UK strengths, and very specifically in defence AI. You've both painted the landscape of geopolitical competition. You've noted our visibility, Sir Anthony, in the wider economic, wider global picture is perhaps room for improvement. What would you consider to be the key UK strengths for applying AI and machine learning in the defence sector? Thank you.
Okay. There is a long-standing UK strength in the area of sensors and instrumentation. This is something that the UK have had a very good scientific base in. The convergence of technologies around quantum sensing and in conjunction with artificial intelligence and with the UK specialisation in sensing seems to me an interesting area. So if you wanted my bets round some of this, it would be there. Possibly the other thing which I think is really interesting is the whole area of privacy preserving machine learning and all the technologies around that, where traditional UK strengths in some of the information security, cryptography and so on might play an important role.
Two quick comments on that. And of course, part of the strength in sensing goes back in turn to strengths in advanced materials, and which was one of the original 8 great technologies, and one of the reasons why experts persuaded me it should be one of the 8 greats. It's fundamental to some of those sensing capacities. Secondly, there is, I have no strong views either way on Palantir, but I do think I'll welcome your question, because one of the other issues in the defence perspective and the special relationship is sometimes we do have a terrible inferiority complex and always think ultimately the Americans are going to be better. And I personally think there was at least one quite strong UK company who I was persuaded had the capacity to analyse NHS data as well as Palantir did, who didn't get the contract. And I think we should not always assume that we are inferior to the Americans in these technologies.
Brings in a very interesting question of SMEs and how they scale and how you might help them do it.
Indeed.
And indeed there are, I should say, and this goes to the thing which is, as many people know, I'm a great believer in novel commercial mechanisms that might lie precisely on this seam, such as NSIF, the National Security Strategic Investment Fund.
And there are several examples of really quite interesting, innovative UK companies losing out in public procurement to large, high-profile US providers.
Indeed. I'm going to go online because we've had some names on there, and I've got 2 more in the room here, and then we'll take it from there. So we have a Peter Varnish on the line, I think. Oscar, check. Can you unmute him? I'll tell you what, while you're teeing that up, I shall go into the room. Yes, please. Ma'am.
Thank you. Amelia Gould, I'm Managing Director of Helsing, which is a great follow-on to the fact you're saying great UK companies, because we're very proud to say that we're leading AI across Europe for defence. But my question is actually related to your system engineering point. So I'm a chartered engineer by background, system engineer, and I'm really interested in what you were saying about how policy needs to change, because in my experience of doing system engineering for 20 years in defence is to change the way, in the way you're talking about re-architecting systems, understanding how adaptive software can fit within a dynamic system, you also need to change the policy around that. And my question was around, do you think that we have the right policies in place, and in all the defence transformations that are happening, they're thinking about the skills needed to move the point of integration from effectively having people in defence procurement used to managing risks and managing big programs into managing integration. Because what you're suggesting by shifting system engineering into the model you've created is by saying actually you're shifting the point of integration into the procurement agency, who need to understand what it is they're buying and how the system is evolving. So do you think we have the right policies and transformations in place to enact that?
I mean, firstly, a brief anecdote. At one point, some time ago, Keith will presumably be aware of this. Dom Cummings showed a significant interest in the state of defence procurement, and I remember meeting a former very senior MOD official who said, well, yes, every so often a troublesome SPAD shows interest in MOD. We just point them towards defence procurement and they'll be gone for several years. We don't need to worry about them any longer. So I'm slightly reluctant to and I should say, by the way, some of my best friends and all. So, so I wholly concur with your view. My feeling is that the nature of the technologies requires all those layers, organizations, systems, processes, and methods to change, and we need to be conscious about doing that. So it's a whole stack change, and that has to start at the very top with the framing policies.
David, do you have anything to
I'd only add that some of the issues in defence procurement, of course, apply to procurement full stop. And in sometimes you're looking at procurement issues, you think that defence has some greater has some advantages over the civil side. I mean, longer term contracting is more possible in MOD often than in a civil environment. Quite a lot of pressures much harder to get beyond a CSR period in many civil programs than on the defence side. The new procurement legislation, and I see a distinguished minister who is responsible for it at the back, Jeremy Quinn. But I hope the new procurement legislation helps, but it's very hard to use procurement in the UK to promote new technologies and innovation compared with what is possible in the US, partly because of deep treasury rules, like you only pay for stuff after it has been delivered. It's very hard to pay up front for stuff to be developed. And let's hope the new legislation creates greater flexibility.
Could I come back on that, because I remember talking to the first head of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Centre in the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, when he was asked about what the most important thing was, and everyone was expecting him to talk about AI in defence, he said acquisition. Really is a version of that. Could you say a little bit about our psychology of contracting? You said you only pay for it when it's delivered, but these things are cutting edge. For it to work, you have to develop an idea. How do you contract for an idea, and what would the value be if we could think that through?
Well, you can pay in advance. I mean, I'm trying to think of a real example, so it isn't too abstract. A real example, which was finally cracked, but it took over 2 years. It began in the run-up to COP26, quite an innovative company that was going to use satellites to track methane emissions, and not methane emissions overall, methane emissions tracked down to a particular location or facility. And they wanted to buy some British satellites, and they wanted to locate in the UK. And what they wanted was a contract to purchase their methane data, which would then lead them to relocate. I tell you, getting that through Whitehall procurement processes was a total nightmare. But eventually it was secured, partly using the satellite applications catapult as kind of arm's length body, and the company GHGSat are now functioning here, and I think already have tracked methane emissions down to Uzbekistan, which seems to be, partly for geological reasons, has a very large amount of methane emissions in a way that was not possible beforehand. So, but that kind of contract, so it can be done, but it was unbelievably hard. And whereas if you go to US technology conferences, you'll meet someone who's got some new gadget and you'll say, that's fantastic, how are you funded? And he'll say, I've sold the first 20,000 to the US government or the DOD, and he'll say, oh really, you produced? He says, no, I haven't produced them yet, I'm still developing them, but I've sold the first 20,000, that's how I'm funded. That model is very hard to reconcile with Treasury rules.
Yeah, I won't say any more than that. I can already see some of the eyes lighting up of people at the back of the room who also carry scar tissue. We've got a little bit more time if I'm allowed to overrun, which, because we started late, I'll try and do. Can we go online? Andrea Norman Walker, Oscar. And if we could move the microphone down to this gentleman down here on the front, your right. Are we still having trouble? Is he going to... James Spencer, sorry, we'll go to the next one down. James Spencer.
And thank you very much indeed for that. Really interesting. We've been talking about national security issues.
Sorry, James, can you just say who you are and who you're representing?
Sorry, James Spencer, political violence at AIG. In Crimea, we've seen Elon Musk cut off access to the Starlink satellite, which has had impacts on the Ukrainian military's ability to operate. Likewise, we've seen quite a lot of the AI being produced by commercial companies. To what extent does the panel think that this is in itself a national security issue when such immensely powerful tools are in individual hands who are fairly unconstrained?
Who wants to take that thorny one first?
Well, I think this is where data and space come together, because often the British media talk about Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk as if they are rich people who have decided to spend the profits from their very successful sort of earthbound companies on a hobby of doing space stuff. What they are doing is they are after a completely integrated strategic asset, where for Bezos it is what happens in your home and Alexa, and a satellite system that enables him to collect all this data and interlink it. And with Elon Musk, it's what happens in your car, in your Tesla, and the satellite system that enables you to collect all this data and interlink it. They are after, these satellites are not some extra add-on, they are going to have incredibly powerful, impervious to external influence, completely integrated systems for collecting and transmitting data, of which their satellite constellations are a key part. Once you realise that satellites are not a hobby bit brought on by a rich person, but are part of the integrated model, and it's a classic American competition, house versus car, you realise why these are indeed very significant sort of security issues. And I think even in the US, I think the people in the US government, that very dramatic incident that was referred to has brought home to them the significance of the power that Elon Musk now has. And I think there's and not least, interest in, for example, the UK OneWeb and other systems, so they're not totally dependent on one system belonging to one man.
I might make an adjunct point, because that's been very well that one's been very well made, which is that some years ago you could sort of you knew what the national security community was. Now the national security community is actually, and the critical elements of it are actually deeply embedded in our critical national infrastructure, in our advanced startups, and in our universities. And we need to build a new form of that national security community. We need to be getting together we need to be discussing. We need to have more that commonly binds us, including training, across this broader new conception of what the community might be.
Yes, I remember interviewing the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, a couple of years ago. He made the point that when NotPetya and WannaCry hit America, he was straight into not just the West Wing but the Oval Office, and you realize that Microsoft had become an agent of the US government over something really very serious at national security level. So maybe we'll come back to that, but we haven't got much time left for final questions. So I think, sir, you might well be the last question.
It's a bit of pressure. Matthew Trimming, I'm Senior Advisor at Public. Thank you for the discussion. It's been fascinating. Public, as some people will know, does evaluation work on major projects. We do innovation training for the MOD, and we're working with a number of civil departments on helping SMEs get in that are focused on AI, get into navigating public procurement, which is a non-trivial task, as you've observed. A reflection on sort of AI and the government's approach last year might be a bit harsh, but I'd be interested in your perspectives, is to say they didn't really ask themselves what would the Victorians have done. Well, they didn't even ask themselves what would the Georgians have done with the longitudinal prize. They didn't really sort of lean into AI as an opportunity. They thought more like, what would the European Commission do? We're going to sort of lean away from it because we're slightly scared about it, and we're going to talk about safety and regulation a lot. Is that a fair characterisation? Maybe a caricature? And do the panellists feel that the government have got the balance right in terms of focusing on growth opportunity rather than just safety? Or is there an opportunity for rebalancing?
And could I just add to that excellent question, which is also a little bit about ethics when we're talking in the defence arena, as well, whether you could reflect, have we over-regulated? Where, given the advances you've postulated, does it leave us with questions around international humanitarian law and the use of AI in defence, and security? Given there are already nations acting in a very Victorian way and looking at the possibilities. Anthony,
Emil, I'll answer the first part first, which is when I was in government, a vast number. There was beginning of people beginning to talk across government and beyond in think tanks and so on about machine learning and artificial intelligence. And for every one meeting I attended where people talked about what this technology could do to make lives better for citizens, I attended 9, which consisted of a bunch of geography graduates speculating about the ethics risks. And it was unbelievably frustrating. So I would say that I am I'm a techno-optimist. I believe in the vast potential for improving life, for improving our security and the safety of our citizens using this technology, and I'm looking to the government to accelerate these issues. Speaking here in policy exchange, I can own that I take a conservative viewpoint on these issues, which is I tend to prefer to regulate for real harms rather than imaginary ones. I prefer to be responsive to the situation as it emerges, and I trust industry and seek to encourage it. And I think that there may be a moment that the government might recall on this issue that it is a conservative government.
Just some quick comments. I mean, first of all, regulation in this context is very odd because all the players are American. Even compared with other technologies, it is so dominantly driven by the US. And let's face it, the kind of model that DeepMind is strong on is not quite the way that generative AI has gone. It's very hard to have a serious regulatory debate which is not essentially about America. Secondly, I do very much agree with what Anthony just said about how you design regulation. Again, in my experience, going back to time as a minister, every time there's a new technology, people want to write a new set of regulations that are highly technology specific, when actually it is better, if at all possible, to use your general framework. IP law remains, theft remains theft. In other words, fraud remains fraud. So trying to endlessly construct new regulatory regimes, highly specifically around for each one technology, is, I think, by and large, a bad way of approaching regulation.
And I think this very neatly comes back to your earlier observation about the current discussions around data and data and IP. So clearly here we do have a challenge. We have an immediate regulatory challenge and likely a legal one. It is an appropriate place for government to concern themselves.
And I would add that, and just finally, I think the way I think Anthony's vivid 9-to-1 ratio does capture a problem. And when you look at just the performance of British industry, you do think actually a little bit more willingness to use some of these tools in a prudent way that protects your own data, as I was saying earlier. But you actually, what is striking on most of these innovations in IT and machine learning and digitization and computing, you see sadly that British industry lags in take-up. So I would have rebalanced a little bit more towards encouraging classic British businesses to use this tool in a smart way, rather than focusing quite so much on trying to create a new regulatory regime.
I think we were lucky that the Lord Peach, perhaps the most senior geography graduate in defence, has had to leave before we made that comment.
Other social sciences are available.
I think I have probably stretched everyone's patience as much as I can. Overrunning others would have to go, so I'll have to draw subs there. But I just thought I'd close by asking the two panellists just to give us sum up thoughts. What are the things they would want you all to take away? And maybe for policy exchange, what are those policy areas that this organisation could be thinking about to address what remain your major concerns? Anthony, do you want to go first?
I think the first thing to say is that, I think it's really important that we continue and extend a broad public dialogue on at this interface of science and technology, policy, defence and security, and we need to think about how to build and sustain that. I think we've made significant advance in government in terms of the mechanisms that are available, but they are neither complete nor well integrated, and I think work needs to be done. On that. The last thing is, and I realise that this is going to sound very professorial of me. I feel that, when it comes to analysing geopolitical tensions and other issues, our analytic tradecraft, if you say, is very good. And I would say our analytic tradecraft around this interface of technology, geopolitics, and and economic concerns and so on are rather poor. So I think there's a real case for understanding how we might undertake that analysis in a better way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually my observation absolutely follows from that, because there are some quite rigorous tools of conventional economic analysis applied by the Treasury. If you turn up and wish to spend some money in a civil programme in a conventional way, if you look at the Treasury Green Book, if you do cost-benefit analysis, you can work out what you think is a rate of return, what the public benefit is. There is a framework of analysis. Doesn't tell the whole story, but it's been developed over years and is relatively sophisticated. we have no similarly sophisticated way of incorporating these strategic and security issues. A lot of it looks like chat, quite well-informed chat, sometimes a bit better than you would read in The Economist, and these are considerations, but turning the argument, a strategic argument, into something that is commensurable with and can be incorporated in a classic treasury cost-benefit analysis way of thinking is really important. And that is, I think, the big gap. And I think that's what, over the years, in the conversations I've had with Anthony, we've both concluded. Because what you can't do, which is what we've got at the moment, is you plough on with the old-fashioned treasury way of doing things, and then somebody turns up from a security background or the MOD or somewhere and trumps it with arbitrary realize what the Chinese are doing. You actually would ideally have some kind of framework of analysis in which both the commercial stuff and the strategic stuff was somehow incorporated in some overall account when you're taking a decision on a policy. And that is, and we know that is what they're wrestling with in the US as well. Doing that is a really interesting and important intellectual challenge, and I don't think we've yet made much progress on it.
Brilliant. I will pull stumps there. I want to thank the panelists because it's rare when you get a panel that will politely disagree and stretch the argument, which I thought was superb. There was an agreement though between them about that closing point, the need to pull policy and strategy, commercial practices together in a more nuanced way than some of them, perhaps the simple way. Let us hope the next general election might be fought on such a sophisticated analysis of where the nation is going. I shan't say too much more than that. But finally, bringing all that things together and referencing one of the questions, and as one myself, I like the way the emphasis has been put on systems engineers and people can understand the breadth of what we're talking about here. Could I ask you please to thank our panel in the usual way? Thank you very much.